Okay, you guys. So this is really a test because I've been trying to go. Okay, you guys are up there, first of all, and I'm looking at my computer down here. But I've been trying to go live all day long, and it has not worked like at all. So I'm gonna just make sure that I'm even live because I've been live before and it's not resulted in anything. So, oh, I'm really live. Okay. So YouTube is fixed. That is good. All right. So let's get into the conversation. Um, I was having, okay, so I've been doing some recorded videos with my man, like really audios, not really video, where we're having just conversations on different topics. So yesterday we did like this whole thing on toxic masculinity. And what was really crazy, and I'm sorry, y'all, I'm looking at my notes and I'm looking, and you guys are up there. So if I'm not looking at you, I apologize. So, anyway, when we were having this discussion on toxic masculinity, which is a concept I don't believe in, and so because I don't believe in toxic masculinity, I never bothered to research where the concept of toxic masculinity came from because the whole thing just seemed pretty, weird. And obviously, I thought it was a feminist talking point. And so, hi, you guys. And so I never delved into it. But after my conversation with him, I really did delve into toxic masculinity and its origins. So in this live, I don't really want to discuss toxic masculinity from a standpoint of what it means per se, but I want to look at its origins. And as I was talking, to my man, and as I was talking to my eldest son about this topic, they both said something to me. And I think a lot of you might be thinking the same thing. They thought, well, Irene, your positionality on this may be biased because of your views of homosexuality and your views of transgenderism. Why are my views on those subjects valid? Well, strangely enough, the individual who came up with the term hegemonic masculinity, which is what we call toxic masculinity in the common vernacular, is a man, which was shocking to me. This blew my mind that this person is a man. But not only is this person a man, this person is a man who presents themselves to be a woman. So this person is a transgender. And the first thing that came to my mind, because when I was like, oh, let's have a discussion on toxic masculinity, and he was like, well, we have to discuss, we're going to have to discuss Raywin Connell, sorry. Raywin, her name is spelled really, or his name, whatever, is spelled really funny. It's like Raewyn, so Raywin Connell. We're going to have to discuss Raywin Connell to really discuss toxic masculinity. And I thought, oh, okay. But then I found out this person was transgender. And I thought, isn't it fascinating that the person that came up with the ideology of toxic masculinity is a man who doesn't want to be a man? I just was like, who is the least qualified person to be spearheading this research if it's not a man who doesn't even want to be a man? So the idea that, I may have some bias, I'm like, do you think that this person has some bias? Do you think toxic masculinity is something that this person may be seeing in places simply because they're not even comfortable with their own manhood? So with that said, I don't want it to seem like I'm being polarized simply because this individual is transgender, even though that plays a big part of it, I'm not going to lie. But I also want to show that I think this is part of a bigger agenda, a homosexual agenda, and to feminize men and to create this gray area. And I'm going to support these hypotheses with both commentary from Connell himself, as well as written things that Connell has shared. So I'm going to be coming like back and forth from here to my computer, sharing my screen with you guys and referencing my notes. And I'm going to try to do my best to really paint a picture that this is bigger than a talk about toxic masculinity. This runs into feminism. This runs into trying to make males effeminate. This runs into the ideology that there's no difference between men and women, except in the cases where a woman is pregnant. And Connell literally says this in some of his writings. So with that said, let me go to the first clip of Connell. Again, remember that Connell is a man that presents as a woman, so do not be shocked that I'm saying he, but you're going to see somebody that is presenting somewhat female on the screen. I'm going to go to this clip because I want to substantiate Connell's idea of what an alternative to the standard of maleness is. So keep this in mind, that this is why I'm playing the clip. I am playing this clip because this is Connell's ideology when Connell talks about what an alternative to the current standard of what being masculine is. And I think it's important that we recognize that Connell's belief in what that alternative looks like is a society of homosexual men. And Connell says this in no uncertain terms. So let me go ahead and share my screen with you. So let's see. Okay, so here we go. And let's just get to it.
And resources in the world. But there is still cultural change about masculinity going on. We might even say that there's a kind of crisis of stereotypes about men and masculinities. There is still, a conception of true masculinity being a kind of hard, hairy phenomenon, which is sort of naturally the center of attention, naturally on top. So we still have our media full of images like this, representations, popular representations of admirable masculinities with women on the margins.
So I want to just stop here because he's painting a contrast between traditional masculinity, and mind you, he's speaking to an audience of women right now. This is a feminist conference of some sort. So he's speaking to an audience of women and he's pandering to the feminist cause. And so, excuse me, this is how, when we speak of toxic masculinity, this is how they like to portray men. Women are just scantily clad off to the side, and men are, the main players, and they've got their bravado, and most importantly, their violence, right? The violence is very important, and we're going to see this later on. So she's painting this picture, or y'all, I hate the confusion, but this individual is painting this picture, and I want you to hear very carefully what the alternative is to this display that we're supposed to be oh so disgusted with.
Was literally on the sidelines cheering the blokes on. Now, that image of there being one true masculinity, which is displayed for us by our footballers, is deep-seated, but there's a lot of research evidence that it's fundamentally wrong. That the realities of human life show an enormous variety of forms of masculinity, of ways of being a man that can be found if you go looking. The anthropologists, for instance, have gone looking in the course of their trawling of different cultures around the globe, And they have provided us, in fact, with some of the most dramatic evidence of the different forms of masculinity and the different ways of being a man that a society can produce and honour. So, for instance, anthropologists have found communities, societies in the world in which all of the young men are homosexual.
Okay, so I'm going to just back that up. For the people coming in the room, I want to put this into context, what we're listening to. This person that we're looking at came up with the theory of hegemonic masculinity, what we would call toxic masculinity. So we call it toxic masculinity. Clinically, it's called hegemonic masculinity. This individual we are looking at is the person who developed that ideology. This individual is a man who does not want to be a man, but wants to be a woman. And we're listening to him show the contrast between what is the presentation of what masculinity normally is, and contrasting that with the type of masculinity he says is a variation of masculinity that would not be accepted by the society at large. And mind you, he's speaking to a conference full of feminists. So the contrast is a society where the young men are all homosexual. So let's just back it up, because you know, so many people are going to say, Irene does not approve of homosexuality. Irene doesn't approve of transgender. She thinks they're mentally ill. So of course, Irene is going to say X, Y, and Z. But we're not 7 minutes into this lecture, and this man has already brought up societies where all the men are gay as being an alternative. So I might have a bias, but I just want to say that this person has a bias too. So let's just back it up a smidgy, hear it through, and then we're going to move on to the rest of the data.
Ways of being a man that can be found if you go looking. The anthropologists, for instance, have gone looking in the course of their trawling of different cultures around the globe, and they have provided us, in fact, with some of the most dramatic evidence of the different forms of masculinity and the different ways of being a man that a society can produce and honour. So, for instance, anthropologists have found communities, societies in the world in which all of the young men are homosexual, actually engage in homosexual practices and not in heterosexual practices. It's the kind of place where Corey Bernardi would feel right at home. And if you're wondering how these societies reproduce themselves, the answer is all the young men turn heterosexual at a later stage of life, marry and have children. Those are communities which simply organise human sexuality in a different way from the way we do, where being a true man is regarded as necessarily being heterosexual.
Okay, so there are a couple of attacks made here, right? The positionality of women in reference to men, and that being a true man doesn't mean being heterosexual. And I'm only pointing this out because as we delve into, and here, let me go ahead and pull off the screen. As we delve into this conversation, I just want to be super clear that for all the bias I may have with regard to the LGBTQI community, this individual has a lot of bias too, because not 5 minutes into a lecture, the first example that they chose to give of what masculinity looks like outside of being hegemonic in nature is homosexuality. And so as we look at the rest of the data, I just want to say that this is something I noticed. So the first thing I want to look at is the idea that Connell has that there is no difference between men and women, and that the only time differences between men and women matter is when women are pregnant, because then we have, a baby inside of somebody's stomach, or when women are being beaten by men, right? When men are engaging in hegemonic masculinity or toxic masculinity. And let's look at that first, and then I want to get into the sleight of hand that's being pulled, where men's emotions, like the idea that it's not okay for them to cry, or they're not really allowed to feel, or they're cold. And a lot of men feel that that's not fair because they're humans too, and I agree. But how those narratives are being used to suck men into a place where being an actual man is considered some sort of disorder that needs to be corrected. So let me go ahead and get to her, the first part that I want to get to, which is her speaking, or him, depending on how you want to take it, which is him speaking on the differences between men and women and how they are non-existent. So yes, let me have a look at that. And I'm going to go ahead and share my screen with you, although all of the links to this will be in the description box. So yes. So let me go ahead and I'm going to share all of these things. Give me just 1 second and I'm going to share my screen with you so that we can read it together. Okay, I want to make sure you guys can hear me. Okay, so where we are right now is we're actually on Raewyn Connell's site. And I'm going to go to the part that says feminism's challenge to biological essentialism. Okay, so I'm going to skip through this a little bit, and I'm just going to go to the part that I have an interest in, where Connell makes a case that men and women are exactly the same, and that the only case, and even argues that there are no biological differences. So it says the idea that gender relations are biologically fixed is shown up as nonsense in the light of the ethnographic and historical evidence of cultural diversity and change. We know the cultural diversity that Connell is speaking of, that we just watched referenced in that lecture, which is societies where the young men are homosexual exclusively. And the idea that being a man doesn't mean being heterosexual. And remember, this is the person that has brought us toxic masculinity. But we can substantiate a simple sex role model instead, assuming that attitudes and emotions are determined by dichotomous roles. One of the most important empirical findings of gender research is that in contemporary affluent societies, this would be white societies, there are few substantial differences in psychological characteristics, attitudes, emotions, intellect, etc., between men and women. Now, mind you, she's talking about white societies where the children go to preschool and are taught to behave in a gender neutral way. And young boys, maybe I'll pull up a clip of this so we can watch it, are reprimanded for doing the things that little boys do. She's talking about societies where gender neutrality is heavily pushed. So let's not mistake what she's speaking of. Or she's talking about societies, like I said, that she mentioned in her lecture, where homosexuality is the preferred sexual preference of the men in the society. So this is very deceptive language, especially when you take it into context with the other things that Connell says in other places. So moving on, it says, One of the most important empirical findings of gender research is that in contemporary affluent societies, at least, there are very few substantial differences in psychological characteristics, attitudes, emotions, intellect, etc., between men and women. This conclusion flies in the face of popular stereotypes, but is supported by a large body of quantitative evidence. Biological essentialism gets its influence from the enormous cultural prestige of biological science since Darwin. And then it goes on to say that the idea that there are sexes and behaviors that are common to the different sexes is European and Christian in nature. And I'm not moved by this because Connell has tried a couple of things to legitimize his work. One is to attack basically white people and Christianity, and the other is to pander to Black people, Black men specifically being in a lower positionality. So this is what I mean. Recently, Nancy Pelosi made a statement when she wanted to attack Trump that inner city youth, not that she cares about inner city youth, but that inner city youth don't have the right to basically say they have ignorance of the law. And she was making this in an attempt to attack Trump, sort of how gay people say gay is the new Black. People use the Black card, right, to position their argument in a more powerful place. And there are a couple of tricks that people use when they want you to go along with what they believe that tend to work in modern day society. One is playing the Black card, comparing your research or belief to the plight of Black people, which Connell does. Two is to blame white men, because everybody hates white men. So if you say white men are the reason for this, then what you're saying must be true. And three is to say it's all because of Christianity, because a lot of people dislike Christianity. So if Christianity says that men should be a certain way and women should be another way, then that's all the proof we need that it's okay for men to just run around being homosexual. Now, remember, I stand by the belief that white people want to create Greek society. They want to recreate Greek society in modern day. So all of these narratives play into doing that, because that was the preference of Greek society. Women were secondary citizens in Greek society, and the men's main orientation was to other men. So with that said, let's keep going. Building a genuine scientific understanding of gender and gender relations is an immense task, involving both biological and social science, as well as rethinking of human history and human evolution. The women's liberation movement is rightly seen as the modern starting point of gender studies. Feminism, right? The women's liberation movement is rightly seen as the modern starting point of gender studies, opening up this whole terrain to serious analysis. Now, I want to go down to, when does gender, like biological gender, actually matter? And the argument that he makes is this doesn't mean that bodies are irrelevant. Far from it. Feminism around the world is deeply concerned with prenatal mortality, infant survival, motherhood, and so forth. This is in contradiction to science, right? Because earlier she says that European-derived popular culture and the value in shoring up existing structures of power and privilege does not get its influence from being good science when it comes to gender dynamics. Most of it's not science at all. And it goes on to say that the ideology uses rhetoric of science looking to what they believed 100 years ago, and that the male and female bodies are not much biologically different from each other, that we are actually not that biologically different. Now, this is crazy to me that Connell works with the United Nations, because it is really stupid to say that men and women biologically aren't that different. Women literally have organs that men don't even possess. Like, we have organs in our bodies that you guys just don't have. That would be, in my eyes, a huge biological difference, right? That would be a huge biological difference. A uterus, that's a big difference. Ovaries, fallopian tubes, those are big differences. Milk ducts are big differences. A vaginal canal, bleeding up to 7 days out of the month, that's a huge difference. Men and women are very different. But the only time that Connell wants to acknowledge these differences is when, and as she said, it deals with prenatal mortality, because at that point, you can't ignore that women are different, right? Once a woman is pregnant, the argument that we're all pretty much the same kind of goes out the window. So they can't say it completely, because women's biological makeup kind of forces them to admit there's some differences. So prenatal mortality, infant survival, motherhood, right? HIV/AIDS, unequal nutrition, domestic violence, rape, when men are being toxically masculine, sexual desire, contraception, prevention of pregnancy, abortion, prevention of reproduction. Then all of a sudden, biology matters, right? But other than that, other than, you know, the whole womb thing and literally being female part, biology doesn't matter. That's Connell's stance. But let's take a look at some of Connell's other positionalities, especially with regard to young men, masculinity, and violence. So I think that this is really important to talk about. And I'll go ahead and I'll look at you guys for a while, because we don't necessarily need to look at this together. When we speak about Connell's view on, and again, for those of you just coming in, when we're talking about Raewyn Connell, we're talking about the transgender, the man who doesn't want to be a man but wants to be a woman, who created the idea of toxic masculinity. And so, strangely enough, this man who doesn't even want to be a man but wants to be a woman came up with the idea of hegemonic masculinity, aka toxic masculinity. And the hyper focus of this is violence, that men are violent. And this is sort of demonizing qualities that men naturally have. Now, am I saying that men are naturally violent? No, but I am saying that men have the benefit of additional aggression, which is beneficial to us societally because of testosterone. Now, Connell will make the argument, and I'm about to get into that now, that testosterone does not increase aggression. Now, mind you, I don't view aggression as a negative thing. Definitely, there are times when it is advantageous for a man to be able to assert his masculinity or aggression or power in situations. That is something that is needed. If it's needed for nothing else, it's needed to control other men, right? Because men are essentially, and I think this is why we find that men are in positions of power more than women, and that our world is very male dominated, because men are positioned to control each other better than we could control men as women or children, because that's essentially what society is made of, right? Men, women, and children. And although that may not make people comfortable to hear, that's sort of their reality, right? And this has led into a lot of other areas that have been exploited to have men feel as though they should reposition themselves and not embrace these masculine standards. So let's look at Connell's work on young men, masculinity, and violence. Now, the original paper that Connell wrote, I believe it was in 1995. Connell is from Australia. The original study was done on Australian boys. Obviously, they were all white boys, because the work that Connell did was not too many years removed from the whitewashing of the Aboriginal people and the theft of their children and all of that. So because it wasn't too far removed, we cannot be surprised that Connell and Australian did the study on white males. And so in that original study, it was observed that there were toxic traits that were promoted to boys unnecessarily in Connell's eyes. And this was hegemonic masculinity. Now, when Connell revisited that original study in 2005, Connell, this transgender person, came up with the idea that it was not only women that were being subverted by the toxic masculine men, it was also other men that were being subverted. Now, I am not saying that there is no truth to men subverting other men, because I just myself said that men are capable of controlling each other more than women or children are capable of controlling men, right? Which is why it is advantageous to them to have the ability to be aggressive when there is a need for aggression. And sometimes, and I know that this is like not new agey and, you know, not going to be a popular thing, sometimes it makes sense to be aggressive. Like, sometimes aggression is needed. Aggression is not necessarily a negative trait. And it's not negative that the bigger and the stronger of humans, which happen to be men, have that trait. It's definitely more advantageous for the bigger and stronger groups of us to have that ability than it is for the teeny tiny people. I mean, how beneficial is aggression to a 2-year-old? How beneficial is hyper aggression, right, to me at 5'2" if I'm faced with somebody who's 6'3" and 300 pounds? So it's proportional to the people that can do the most with that energy. And I don't think that that's a negative thing. But of course, when we talk about toxic masculinity, the ability to call on your aggression when needed and to be powerful and forceful when needed is viewed as a negative trait for men. And so in this study, when Connell addressed young men masculinity and violence, when he revisited that study in 2005, she followed it up with talking about non-white men. And this is sort of where the pedal hit the metal to me, right? In the study she did on men who were disenfranchised, non-white men, she found that they were subverted as well by hyper-masculine men, by men who were hegemonic, who were suffering from hegemonic masculinity, or what we would call toxic masculinity. And so this allowed a lot of people in the Black community, which is why I'm talking about it, to embrace the idea of toxic masculinity, because then you could point and say it's just white men who have toxic masculinity, which is interesting because we know that the idea in society is that Black men are actually the ones who are the most toxic, the most violent, the most aggressive, the most hypersexual, all of those things. Even though Connell's work actually says that Black men are subverted, but I'm not moved by Connell's work saying that Black men are subverted, because I think it is an attempt to play up toward men not wanting to position themselves in areas where they're not allowed to feel, where they are feeling oppressed. I think it's a pandering to men who feel disenfranchised and saying it's okay to be softer, to be a little weak. It's okay, in Connell's words, to be homosexual. All of these things are okay. Hey, Stephen, thank you. And also Solid 9, thank you. I appreciate that. So I want to go to what toxic masculinity looks like and the presentation of the rejection of what that is. And I'm going to share another clip with you guys. But before we go to this clip, let's look at what Connell has to say in his own words with regard to toxic masculinity. And I'll go ahead and I'll share my screen with you guys one more time. Okay, so now we're back to Raywin Connell's website, where Raywin is now discussing young men, masculinity, and violence. So it is pivotal to understand that the subordination of women and of men who are weak, right? And of homosexuals, that all of these things are because, in Raywin's mind, of toxic masculinity. Now, I cannot say enough that we have to remember that the source of this ideology is a man who doesn't even want to be a man himself, is a man who wants to be a woman. So if this man finds masculinity toxic in himself to the point where he wants to be a woman and is living as a woman, we cannot expect this person to do anything but find masculinity toxic in other men. And I think that it's important to recognize that. So with that said, let's go ahead and go down. So when we're talking about toxic masculinity, or hegemonic masculinity, she says, or he says, we can correct some of the muddy thinking. Well, let's back it up. It says there have recently been episodes of violence in the streets of Sydney, which have attracted huge attention. The media label for the problem is alcohol-fueled violence, and the authorities have just announced a package of control measures. Blame is being shared out of the male brain, macho culture, the demon drink, not enough police, weak sentencing by judges, and more. So the male brain, right? That's where this violence is coming from. Macho culture, so men acting like men and not being effeminate is supposedly the source of this violence. Alcohol, not enough people to control the men, so not enough police. And weak sentencing by judges. So judges are just letting men run amok, right? We can correct some of the muddy thinking, is what Connell says. And Connell goes on to say, the recent outcry in Sydney about alcohol-fueled violence has many people asking whether young men are out of control. If we are concerned with men's violence, and the half-hidden epidemics of family violence, because remember, men beat up women, sexual harassment, and rape that are wider problems than street bashings by strangers, but the street violence is worrying and has gotten more attention than all this violence against women. Remember, Connell is a man who thinks he's a woman who's also a feminist, right? The person that created toxic masculinity. And so here we hear the overall picture of Connell's theology in Connell's own words, that rape, that men are running around, they're raping women, they're beating up their families, they are engaging in sexual harassment, there's a hidden epidemic of family violence, and they're bashing people in the heads on the street. Men are doing all this stuff, right? Can we blame the male brain, testosterone, or genetics? Connell asks. Are young men hangovers from a primitive world where males fight cave bears? So like all of this demeaning talk about men. Oh, is it just the male brain and testosterone? You guys are just cavemen, and all of this behavior that you're engaging in is all because, you know, you're kind of ancient relics of old days where you had to fight bears and act stupid. And Connell goes on to say more than 100 years of research looking for broad psychological differences between men and women have found remarkably few. Really? Okay, heterosexuals in the room. How many of you feel that you are mentally the same as the man or woman that you're in a relationship with? Because I know that I find men to be very mentally different than women in practice and in reality. So I would think our day-to-day interactions speak different, but Connell, again, not because of anything valid, just because Connell's been given a stage and feminists like the term toxic masculinity. And the feminists liked it even more that a man who wants to be a woman thought up the term of hegemonic, AKA toxic masculinity. Is any of this being given any validity? Not because it's rooted in the truth, because anybody who's hung out with just little girls and little boys or been in a heterosexual relationship knows that men and women are dramatically different, even on a mental level, putting the physical aside. So it goes on to say that these findings go against many of our stereotypes, but the evidence is strong. We cannot explain men's involvement in violence by generalized sex difference in mentalities, nor can we blame a criminal type, because you guys are criminals too, men, of human being. And then Connell goes on to say, is it the media? Like, why are men acting differently than women when there's no real reason for them to act differently than women? But again, remember, the source is a man who thinks he's a woman. So the confusion is rife here, right? And so Connell suggests that we look hard into the social situations in which violence is happening, and we need to ask what else is happening in these young men's lives that is causing men to behave collectively in this sort of way. Fascinating stuff. Now, I want to go to a TED Talk, Why I'm Done Being Man Enough. And let's just take a look at what this man has to say.
My brother heard that. And for as long as I can remember, I've been told the kind of man that I should grow up to be. As a boy, all I wanted was to be accepted and liked by the other boys. But that acceptance meant I had to acquire this almost disgusted view of the feminine. And since we were told that feminine is the opposite of masculine, I either had to reject embodying any of these qualities or face rejection myself.
Okay, so I'm going to pause it here because this is the narrative that is sucking a lot of men in. Boys being raised to have a disgusted view of the feminine. So by disgusted view of the feminine means we don't promote effeminate behaviors in men as a society. We don't do it. And we don't do it because we don't want to seed abnormality, right, in the sexes. Now, sometimes boys are told, suck it up, don't cry, things like that. And you will have men like this and men thinking that they're women like Connell come forward and say, look, men, you don't get to be people. Nobody wants you to feel. Being a man means that you have to be hard and emotionless and you can't. Well, that's not true. There's like a middle ground between being hard and emotionless and just being being Connell, not even wanting to be a man at all, or, hating everything feminine. Most of the men that I know who are masculine are still human beings. They still have feelings and emotions, but the narrative is being painted that society is denying men this right. And since society is denying men this right, then men, come on over here to the effeminate side of the street, where we care about your emotions, where you can cry if you need to. Want to be a woman? We got you. Want to be a homosexual? We got you. You don't have to be strong. You don't have to be a leader. You don't have to be in charge. Those aren't things that you have to do as men. Those are things society is forcing you to do as men, and it's holding you back. And that's the narrative that he's trying to paint.
This is the script that we've been given, right? Girls are weak and boys are strong.
So is that a script? Are boys being strong and girls being weak? Is that a script? I just want to know. Or is that reality? Do you know what I'm saying? Now, are there weaker men? Yes, there are. Are there stronger women? Yes, there are. But like in real life, are women not weaker than men? Why is it that we think rape is more egregious when it happens to a woman than when it happens to a man? Why, like if a woman rapes a man and if a man rapes a woman, why do we feel the more egregious act is the woman? Is it because we just hate men and don't have sympathy for them? Or is it because in most cases, a woman really is weaker than a man? So no matter how hard she fights, most women aren't going to be able to fight off a man who is stronger than her. We think the men have a fighting chance. Does this mean that we don't sympathize with victims of rape that are men? No. In fact, I would say that we are more disgusted when men rape other men because we view it as being hyper violent, more so violent than even raping a woman. But we do have what could come across as a lack of sympathy of a woman raping a man, because in our minds, we recognize that men are literally stronger than women most of the time. So that if there is not blackmail going on, right, the man is in a position to physically stop a woman from harming him. because men are typically stronger. This isn't a narrative that somebody is painting. This isn't make believe and we're just pretending that men are stronger than women and all the women in the world are just walking around pretending to be weaker than men. When in reality, you guys, we could beat your asses. Men, little do you know that women are actually stronger than you. We could knock your block off, but we just enjoy pretending like you guys are the stronger ones. We could grow bigger and be larger than you, but we just enjoy being smaller in frame than you. Our bones just enjoy being tinier than yours. Our muscles just enjoy being less developed than yours, right? We're just purposely having a higher fat content to our bodies and totally different fat distribution than you. Those are things that we're doing on purpose. That's a narrative that we're painting. That's not reality. And that's where I say, like, these arguments and reality don't mesh up. But they pander to men with a real argument, which is that men are often called on to be stronger, less emotional, and all of that, right? And then they drag them into stupid land where they go, well, if you want to be able to cry from time to time without somebody telling you, you know, that you're not being a proper man, then let's go over here into left field, where you just become a homosexual or a transgender person and you just don't be a leader and you know, don't have any aggression about you, because aggression is a bad thing all the time. It's never a good thing. And so the fact that he would even be comfortable having a conversation about why he's not trying to be man enough is shocking to me. But I guess this is where we are, thanks to the ideology of toxic masculinity.
It's what's being subconsciously communicated to hundreds of millions of young boys and girls all over the world, just like it was with me. Well, I came here today to say, as a man, that this is wrong, this is toxic, and it has to end.
It's toxic. It's toxic.
Now, I'm not here to give a history lesson. We likely all know how we got here, okay? But I'm just a guy that woke up after 30 years and realized that I was living in a state of conflict. Conflict with who I feel I am in my core, and conflict with who the world tells me as a man I should be. But I don't have a desire to fit into the current broken definition of masculinity, because I don't just want to be a good man. I want to be a good human.
Right, because the two things are different. We're just going to stop there because he just goes on to some stupid stuff that I'm not willing to listen to. But the idea there is that to be a good man is not to be a good human. Because if you fit into the mold of the strong leader type, of the ability to be more aggressive when aggression calls for it, then you are then being toxic. And I'm not going to beat a dead horse with this, but I do want to just look at a couple more of Connell's talking points, because I just cannot get over, you guys. I'm going to keep saying it, because any men who are somewhat identifying with this idea that they don't want to be expected to be hyper masculine in any way, or that they don't want to be expected to not, you know, burst out into tears at every little thing, or, you know, that feel that there's something about them as a man that is negative. I think it's important to recognize the source of the ideology of toxic masculinity is a transgender, is a man who doesn't even want to be a woman. The person who did the initial studies and came up with hegemonic masculinity, which is toxic masculinity, is a man that hates being a man so much that he wants to be a girl. Like in real life, this is actually the person that came up with toxic masculinity. So everything that we're hearing to me sounds like the seedings of trying to get other men to not want to be men too. Everything about manhood is negative, says the person who wants to be a girl, but is really a boy. And then you have these men parroting off the ideologies of a transgender. And I don't think that, I mean, I didn't know it until my man told me when we were having this conversation. I was just like, are you kidding me? How is this taken off? How is any man relating to this at all? When the source of the ideology is a man who doesn't even want to be a man. And I was told I could not like harbor on it, you know, because people would say, you know, Irene, you're biased, you're attacking the person and not the ideology. All I'm saying is that, could this person be a little biased? Are we actually surprised that a transgender with a psychology degree came up with a whole ideology about masculinity being toxic? That's actually not surprising. That's not surprising to me. You don't even want to be a boy. You want to be a girl. Of course you're going to find aggression toxic. Of course you're going to find male leadership toxic. Of course you're going to find heterosexual men toxic. Of course you're going to say that an alternative to hegemonic masculinity or toxic masculinity is a whole society of homosexuals. For those of you who were not here for that part of the lecture, where we sat here and watched a transgender tell us that an alternative to toxic masculinity was for all the men to be gay, as he talks to an audience of feminists. So it's hard for me to separate the person from the science, especially when the person keeps making stupid arguments, like men and women are biologically more similar than they are different. I mean, it's not just that I have an innie and some of you guys have an outie that makes us different. It's that there used to be another human being inside of me. The fact that a transgender can go and put silicone to get what I have naturally doesn't make us not that different. There's like milk that can come out of these. There's a baby that can come out of there. That's a huge difference. Those aren't minor differences. That's like big. And the idea that testosterone doesn't affect the mentality of men to make them different also on an emotional level. We know that this is BS because who has heard of roid rage? You know what roid rage is? When people take steroids or testosterone, and then they have bouts of aggression because they're taking too much, right? There have been studies, and I'll link some down below, that have correlated higher levels of testosterone to more aggression. I don't think aggression is a dirty word, though. Unlike this man who wants to be a woman who came up with the theory of toxic masculinity, I don't find aggression to be a problem. Sometimes aggression is needed. We don't live in a world full of teddy bears. Everybody's not around here, you know, farting rainbows and hugging piles of cotton candy. Somebody's got to be aggressive. That's a positive trait. There, you know, when you enter a situation where there is danger, do we all want to start crying and running? Do we not want somebody that's capable of like facing that? When a crisis happens in your household, you're low on money, a disaster has happened. Does everybody need to fall apart? Can somebody be the leader? And is it really a negative thing if that person is a man most of the time? Or does it not make sense? Women, let me tell you something. Okay, I would hate, let's have like a real conversation for the ladies in the room. When it's our time of the month, we basically just want to sleep. We just want to sleep. We just want to go to freaking bed. We're so exhausted. When you're pregnant, you get to a size in your pregnancy where you can't even really maintain your own balance. You might fall over yourself. After you give birth, you are weak. You need somebody there who is stronger, who doesn't have those issues to be a protection for you. This is just reality. So I don't think that it's a negative thing, but like I said, we have to consider the source. When the source is a man who wants to be a woman, when the source of the theory of toxic masculinity or hegemonic masculinity is a transgender, a man who hates being a man and would rather live as a woman, how can we even believe in toxic masculinity? This is coming from a person not even comfortable with their own manhood, no less being masculine. This is coming from a person who doesn't want to be masculine at all. They want to be a girl. And I mean, I think the whole thing, why am I like, I'm so upset that I didn't know this sooner, you guys. Like, am I the only person that didn't know this sooner? Am I? Did any of you guys in the chat know this about toxic masculinity? That the person who created the ideology of toxic masculinity was a man who wants to be a woman? Am I the only person that knew that? I might be the only person that knew that. I might be the only person that didn't know that. So I think this is where I'm going to leave this off. I have some controversial videos coming up next week. I want to talk about homosexuality and child sexual abuse. And I'm going to pull out some studies to show that they're skewing the numbers and that homosexuals are twice as likely to abuse children than heterosexuals. I mean, I'm just going to do it. I'm also going to be bringing up some things that have nothing to do with sexuality, but we're going to be getting into the Malia Davis case and another case with a young Black girl who recently died, and how this ties into policing our community and how that's not necessarily about us controlling each other, but protecting each other. But as the week goes by and as you guys are watching those videos, just know that like there's clearly an agenda afoot. And the agenda in my mind is extremely problematic, to say like the very, very least of it. And I'm side-eyeing this conversation about toxic masculinity so much more now that I know that the person who came up with the idea of toxic masculinity, the person who coined the term hegemonic masculinity, is a man who wants to be a woman. Like, my mind is blown, y'all. I mean, maybe it's just me. I don't even think toxic masculinity exists, Vito. I really don't. But with that said, I'm going to get out of here. This was something I was going to make a pre-recorded video for this, but I just decided not to. I just decided to do it this way because, y'all, my mind was blown. I mean, I don't ever want to hear anything else about any traits of men being negative, like, ever again in life. Because from here on out, it just has no validity to me. I knew that I wasn't vibing with this idea of toxic masculinity, but now that I know the source, I really don't vibe with it. I just don't think that we can co-sign anything that a mentally ill person comes up with. You are mentally ill. You don't even want to be a boy. How are you going to talk about another dude being toxic? You're completely incapable of actually even wanting to be a man, period. You literally want to be a girl. So the idea that you would try to drag other men down this rabbit hole with you, that is not surprising to me. That is not surprising to me at all. I find it disgusting. I find it deceptive. I understand why the feminists love it. You know, the feminists love themselves a gay, a man who does not want to have any authority over them. They just love that. They're just eating it up. A man who wants to be a girl, completely non-threatening. So I get why they put so much support behind this, but we have to watch this because the United Nations, this transgender person is advising the United Nations in their gender research and gender equality positions. This person has a whole ideology for how to revamp the educational system. This person is literally, their research is behind a lot of the social movements of the time that we're seeing with gender relations. That's pretty serious. One confused, mentally ill transgender has started a movement that is an attack on men like no other. That is insane to me. It's insane that the backbone of all of these movements and ideology is a man who wants to be a girl. I just can't get over it. I can't. I could rant about this literally forever, you guys. I honestly could. I could rant about this forever, but I won't, because I think you guys get the point. So screw toxic masculinity and screw the transgender who came up with it. Just because you're gender confused and don't want to be a man doesn't mean you have to ruin all the other men too. Like, really? That's not what we need. We have enough on our hands dealing with the likes of you. But now I'm telling you guys, this is what comes from not treating mental illness. This is what comes from not treating mental illness. Is now these people are getting degrees and they are creating their mental illness. They're creating whole ideologies based on their mental illness. This mess has to quit. Like, when are we going to put our foot down to this? This is what I want to know. When are we going to say enough is really enough? Like, we need to start treating people and not co-signing them, because this is becoming dangerous. Because now that this person has a degree, they're capable of developing a whole ideology that is being used to emasculate men. That's just, I don't know. Like, that's insane for me. Thanks, Vernon. It's insane to me. I just, like I said, I could rant about this forever, but I won't. I'll just say it one more time. Whenever we hear anything about toxic masculinity, whenever we hear people trying to, pander to men's emotions, oh, don't you want to cry? Oh, aren't you tired of having to be like the strong one and the leader? Oh, women, aren't you tired of, men telling you what to do and being in charge of everything? Every time we hear these conversations, I just advise us to take pause and consider the source. Is a white man who wants to be a woman. That's the source. White dude that wants to be a girl. How can we trust that? We cannot trust that. I'm gonna go. I'm so serious. I could rant about this forever because it's so disgusting. I feel it's so insidious. And it makes me look at the whole climate of feminism. Not that I was ever on board with feminism, but still, I look at feminism, toxic masculinity, the MGTOW movement, all of these guys, who don't want to lead households and are, want to go cry in a corner somewhere. That weird dude who wanted, his girlfriend to bring him home a present with a bow, and treat him like a girl. Like, they're being manipulated by a transgender. How is that? Somebody said in my comment section that, these people are very tricky. They are very tricky. They are very tricky. And we need to keep two good eyes on this mess. This person is walking around, I didn't even get into their conversation about transgenderism, but this man is a full-on transgender feminist, creating an ideology for toxic masculinity, and refused to talk about transgenderism or being transgender for years for the purpose of deception. But I didn't even read that part of the dialogue. The link to the website for this individual will be down below. I strongly advise you read the studies that this man has done. I strongly advise you read the original study with regard to hegemonic masculinity, AKA toxic masculinity, the subsequent studies, the work this person has been doing, watch some of the lectures, because I think that it's important we familiarize ourselves with the rhetoric so that when you hear part of the rhetoric, you recognize it for what it is and you don't fall for it, even if some of it resonates true with you. That we separate the extremes, because, you know, you get pulled in with sugar. You know, there's always an ounce of sense to BS, right? Whenever somebody wants to be deceptive or tell a lie, the best thing they can do is include a little bit of truth in that, because you'll cling to that bit of truth and you'll swallow the poison with the sugar. And so we just have to really tread lightly and really keep our eye on these weird movements, because y'all, the deception is high these days. The deception is high. And actually, I have to tell you, these people are doing way more than I ever thought they were doing in society. They really are. Like, I'm shocked. I'm so shocked at how the ideology of toxic masculinity has come up. I'm shocked. The deception is super high. It just really, really is. And so I don't know, like, if you guys have anything to add to this, please do share it, you know, in the comment section, and just be on guard. Be on guard for these ideologies that are created by individuals who hate themselves. Be on guard, because there is an attack on Black male masculinity right now in the name of toxic masculinity, and we need to be on guard and recognize that this is literally coming from a white man who wants to be a woman, and that our community needs to have no parts in this. If they want to rip their community to shreds and destroy and you know, make all their men be feminine, let them do it. But that has nothing to do with us, nothing whatsoever. We need to just jump off this train while we're ahead. And we need to not embrace people who are embracing these ideologies in the community. But I'll get to that in a different discussion later this week. And with that said, I will talk to you guys later. I'm sorry that I ranted on and on and on, you guys, but I was so triggered by this. I really was. I was so triggered. You have no idea. I'll talk to you guys later.